fever, cough, congestion. When the symptoms keep coming, but you've got to keep going, you can rely on Mucinex Fast Max All-in-One. Just one dose of Mucinex Fast Max All-in-One relieves up to 9 cold and flu symptoms, helping you get on with your day. Need cold and flu relief? Get Mucinex Fast Max All-in-One and Done Relief. It's comeback season. Use as directed.
18 years from tonight, Grant Gill will become a comedy legend when he totally kills it at his improv class's graduation performance. Knees will be slapped. Hilarity will ensue. That's why he's already keeping himself in shape and razor sharp today with wellness tips and tools from AARP to help make sure his health lives as long as he does. Because the younger you are, the more you need AARP. Learn more at aarp.org/healthyliving.
Hello, Beat Check listeners. I'm Gosia Wozniacka, and I'm the environmental justice reporter at the Oregonian. Today, I'm going to step away from my usual focus on the environment and climate to talk about an investigative story that just published on OregonLive and in the Oregonian. It's an important story, so we want to have this conversation as soon as possible. This story focuses on one Oregon teenager who was repeatedly trafficked for sex, and on how the foster care system failed to protect her, failed to keep her safe. And here to discuss this story is the author, Hillary Borrud. Hillary is an investigative reporter at the Oregonian, and we're going to talk about how sex trafficking of children can happen in a city like Portland, why our state is failing those children most at risk, and the response of the foster care system to this story. So let's get started. Welcome to the show, Hillary.
Thank you.
So before we dive in, I would like us to hear the voice of Grace. Grace is the teenager the story focuses on.
I always tell people, like, when they think of that type of concept, like human trafficking, you think of like little kids being like sent overseas, or like, you know, girls being like, you know, chained to the fence in a basement, you know, like you don't think about the girl in your local prostitution strip.
Hillary, the first thing I wanted to ask you before we get into the details of Grace's case is if you could define what sex trafficking means, because I think most people think of trafficking as something that happens to girls and women from outside the country, not to local American girls in the Portland area. So tell us what sex trafficking means.
Sure. It is a term that has evolved in how people are using it in the United States, but there have been a number of federal laws around that now in the last decade or two. So it can really apply to a broad range of things where basically, if you're talking about an adult, they would be compelled in some manner to engage in things like prostitution or sex work, but they'd be compelled. It could also be that someone is making money off of selling images or some other kind of something else of value that is exploiting them. But in the case of kids, they can't consent to this stuff. And so there doesn't even have to be any compelling going on for minors. And it could be anything from what people used to call child prostitution, which is not a term that is used as much these days. So in the case of this story, that was what happened. And we describe it in some places as being trafficked or being sold for sex. Or child sex trafficking could involve even a child who is engaging in survival sex, or which could be to get food or housing, or they could be doing this for drugs. It could also be that they're just sharing some explicit images for someone who's then giving them shelter or sending them money on Cash App or something like that. So there's a range of things that it can cover. And you will hear this described sometimes by various people and researchers as commercial sexual exploitation of children. So those are pretty much interchangeable terms.
So your story focuses on one young woman, Grace, who entered the foster care system when she was 11 years old. And then while she was in the foster system, she was repeatedly trafficked for sex. How did you first find this story?
Yeah, so I became aware of Grace's situation a number of years ago now. Someone who had a connection to her was concerned about her. And at this point, she was in foster care, and this person was just expressing some disbelief of this is supposed to be foster care is supposed to keep her safer, and this is the state that has legal custody of her, and yet she's actually going missing a lot and being exploited by men. And it sounded at first like kind of an unbelievable story. And if you go looking for information for this, you'll see some news reports and academic research or organizations that are focused on this problem, but it still was kind of surprising to hear about it happening here. But then I started to see that there were actual court cases against some of these pimps or traffickers, and that this really had been happening.
Now, you followed Grace's life for more than 18 months. What was that reporting like? What did it entail?
Mm-hmm. So that was the time period when I actually made contact with Grace, and she had been in the news some because she'd been missing from Oregon foster care, and the state didn't used to put out alerts about young people when they would run away or go missing from care, but they've changed their policy in the last several years, and they started to do that. And so I'd actually seen when she was just out there and in danger, and it was being publicized. And so getting to talk to her was almost surreal at first, and really good to make that connection and hear about things from her perspective. Mm-hmm. She's definitely gone through some ups and downs during the time that I've known her, and it's hard to hear about some of the things that she's gone through, a lot of the things that she's gone through in her life. But also, I think I could see how she's just really a survivor to have gotten to this point.
And then in addition to talking with Grace, you talked with other folks and you looked through reams and reams of documents. Where did those documents come from?
Yeah, the documents are kind of unusual for reporters to see. And actually, I had not seen these kinds of documents before, despite reporting on Oregon Department of Human Services and Child Welfare for about a decade, off and on as a state government and politics reporter, because these records, they are public records, but members of the general public don't have access to these, unlike a lot of other records like your city budget or reports on how other state agencies are doing or something like that, because they are really sensitive. And so access to them is really limited to the people who are named in the records. And so Grace had to request these records from the state because she can do that, but they were heavily redacted, even to black out the names of anyone who was not her in most cases, including even some of the people accused of exploiting her.
During those 18 months that you were in conversation with Grace, what were the most important words that you heard from her? The most important part of the story that kind of solidified for you, okay, like this is what this story is about?
Yeah, so I think that starting out, I thought this was a story that was focused on how could the state fail to keep her safe once she was in foster care, because that was what was most obvious. From what we knew from the outset, we could see the court records that she'd actually been exploited by these men, these pimps who had been prosecuted. And then what I'd heard from her initially from the first person who'd reported this situation to me was a tip. Seeing her records and then hearing her perspective, she felt like the state could have helped her when she was a child so many times. And seeing in the records that by around the time that she was taken into foster care, in 2016, her family had had 39 calls reporting concerns about neglect or abuse about her family. That started 2 years before she was born, but it just gives a sense of how many individuals were out there just repeatedly raising concerns about the family, and yet she stayed with her family. And so that was her main point to me, was how could the state have left me in this situation where I was being sexually abused, I was being neglected for so long, and that shaped my trajectory and what happened to me.
I just feel like there was a lot of different times when DHS could have stepped in and did something more, but they waited until it was all too late.
So it wasn't just while she was in foster care, but also before that the state failed to intervene.
Yeah, that's right. And that was her perspective. And so I think that carries a lot of weight for me. It made the story more complicated.
Yeah.
To think about it that way as well.
Right, because her earlier life really shaped who she became and how she reacted when she got older, and so that would make total sense that she would that was something that she was concerned about. So, as you mentioned, Grace was someone who had pretty troubled childhood, and there were many people reporting possible abuse when she was young. So she already had some risk factors. Can you talk a little bit about what makes children vulnerable to being trafficked for sex? What risk factors did Grace have, and what other kids can have as well?
Sure. So when I talked to some officials from Oregon Child Welfare, they made the point that by the time that kids come into state care, into the foster system, they have often gone through a lot of trauma. There's a technical term for it, adverse childhood experiences, and there's been research showing that these really, really difficult types of maltreatment or other experiences that kids can have early in their life, even in the first few years, can have a long-term impact on their lives. And so the state raised this issue of, well, it's not just that bad things happen when kids are in foster care. They're coming to foster care with a lot of trauma. And so that can put them at risk already by the time they're in state care of being exploited by traffickers or other individuals. With that said, the research that's out there on what could make kids particularly at risk for being trafficked or commercially sexually exploited, the research that I saw, I wasn't necessarily saying that it was the cause, but it was correlated with higher levels of childhood maltreatment and trauma, specifically some examples, sex abuse, physical and emotional neglect and abuse. And so in Grace's case, that stuff was definitely, that was all happening to her and happening repeatedly during her early years. She was, as we discussed in the story, born with an addiction to opioids because her biological mom had been using heavy amounts of prescription pain medications, including a fentanyl patch. So that was kind of something that was happening with a lot of people back in 2 decades ago when she was born. But she described that her mom was often just asleep all the time. So if you think of a little kid at home and no one's watching them or interacting with them, and then she was sexually abused while her mom was not able to protect her too. So those are some of the factors.
It's a pretty tough childhood to have. One thing you mentioned when we were talking before we started recording is that this wasn't necessarily a low-income family. I think, often the stereotype is, that children who come from these backgrounds, they're, often from low-income families that are, completely neglectful. And it doesn't seem like this was fully the case for Grace's family. Can you tell us a little more about that?
Sure. I thought that was really interesting about this case and this family, and Grace's story as well. She did have that issue of her mom with the dependence on the opioids, which was discussed by caseworkers repeatedly in her file, and then was something that Grace told me was a key reason why her mom was not there for her throughout much of her childhood. But yeah, we do hear a lot of discussion of our kids being taken away from their families and put in foster care because the families simply lack the resources. And so then that gets considered as neglect, and they get removed because the families are just poor, basically. And in this case, Grace's family, she had at least a couple of generations of family in Portland, and had grandparents who had a beach house that the family would go to, for example. But her mom had some limited resources. So in her actual so her family did have, at a generational level, some resources, and instead, in this case, the neglect seemed to be largely tied to the addiction issues that were going on, and just family dynamics of, for whatever reason, not confronting or not stopping the abuse that was happening to her. And it was also interesting to see that the state in this case, they were really, for so many years, focused on keeping her family together, keeping Grace with her mother and in her mother's care. And they were also helping provide a lot of resources in the home. Like there was counseling and other supports for Grace. Her mom was getting help from a local community services agency with even cleaning their home and sending a variety of services to the home. And yet this terrible abuse and neglect still happened and continued to happen.
Can you talk a little bit about why the failure of the system came to pass? And we have sort of two separate failures. The first one, which you just described, is that the state didn't believe the abuse and didn't stop it while she was living with her biological family. And then the second level is that after she entered the foster system, the state failed to protect her from sex trafficking. And so how did those two levels of failure came to pass?
So with the failures where she was left in a neglectful situation where she was sexually abused repeatedly, it did seem like the state was focused on keeping her with her mom, just given how much resources they dedicated to supporting the family while keeping her there. And Oregon's policy has changed over the years. They didn't go into too much depth on this, but at one point they were doing something called differential response. I don't know from her case file whether that was what was specifically behind how they handled that, but differential response was just supposed to give more flexibility to caseworkers to not yank kids out of their homes too quickly, and try and keep families together more. So they could have access to more resources or just more flexibility in how to handle those. But again, I don't know if that was specifically what was going on back then. Another thing that I spoke to an attorney named Paul Galm for the story, and he brought up that he's someone who has sued on behalf of clients who are children in Oregon foster care. And he said that he's seen it again and again, that calls will come in reporting what someone thinks is abuse or neglect to the state's hotline, the Child Protective Services hotline. And over many years, he's seen that workers there don't connect that a particular home or a living situation, whether it's the foster parent or the biological family or some other caregivers, have just had some repeated previous reports. And so I think he said, he gave an example of there can be cases he's seen where there had been 12 previous calls, and it's not until the 13th call that they remove the child from the living situation that turns out to have been really traumatizing to them. And of course, in this case, there had been 39 calls about her family by the time she was removed to foster care.
I don't understand how you just let somebody keep a child if so many people are calling and reporting so many different things, but also the same things as well.
And then what about that second level, the sex trafficking? And again, this is you describe a systemic problem. Even though some folks would want to blame the victim or blame the foster families, here it's actually the foster system that didn't do its job. And why did that come to pass when it came to protecting her from the sex trafficking? Where were the holes?
So I do want to say, I think in a lot of these cases, I've heard from people that it can be hard who work with these kids, that it can be hard to even identify when a kid has been trafficked, which I don't think that really covers or explains away the fact that they're not being identified more often. But I think that kids themselves, they're very unlikely to say, hey, I've been trafficked or I was exploited. And they often see things as it was their fault, they messed up, or there are just other ways that they just see it as something related to their circumstances, and their circumstances are bad. And so they had to do this or that as a result of it. So just for some context, for how the state failed to keep her safe, we don't have great systems set up right now or services specifically to address this. And Grace was often going to shelters, youth shelters, and then running away from there because there was just no connection there. She described having this feeling that the people there didn't care about her, that the workers weren't necessarily paid that well. And overall, there was a lack of connection, and kids who are going into foster care, their connections are often severed from any loved ones, from family that they might still feel connected to, even if the family was abusive or neglectful. So I've certainly heard from people who have researched these issues and why kids, for example, run away from care, that having those connections, any kind of connection, is really important. So if you have a foster mom in the Portland area who you're really close to, and then you get sent to Southern Oregon like Grace was, and you might have some extended family members in the Portland area too, what's keeping you in Oregon when you have something that makes you want to run away? I mean, she blamed there was another youth in the program who wanted to run away and kind of recruited her. But whatever the case was, she wasn't right where she had those stronger connections, and her foster mom had been considering adopting her. So she was definitely close with that person. So more of a focus on that in the system. They need more placements where kids can go and be close to their loved ones or their connections.
Well, your story talks about screening for trafficking that happens within the foster system. Can you talk a little bit about what the screening entails, basically how caseworkers screen foster children for risks of trafficking, and why did that fail, Grace?
So just in concrete terms, what the screening is there are 2 forms that caseworkers are supposed to fill out every time a kid comes back from running away or going missing. And one just has a list of questions. I believe each one is only 1 or 2 pages at most. One has questions that they go through and answer that can just identify if they seem like maybe they'd had a trafficking experience while they were missing from care or their placement where they're supposed to be. The second one just has questions that could tell state workers whether they're at risk. So some of the things that could be screened for, I don't have it in front of me, but just the things that the Child Welfare Manual tells workers to be on the lookout for as well are like having an older boyfriend, not knowing the name of the boyfriend, having met someone online, showing up with a lot of money or something else of value that it's not explained why the child would have that. So it's supposed to happen every time they go missing and come back. Oregon has also said that they have a rule in place to do that for every kid who enters the state foster care system. But what we found with the kids who were going missing is it's only happening a fraction of the time. And the spokesman for the state said that was because it's a really complex issue and workers might not always understand how they're supposed to handle it. So in Grace's case, we couldn't find anything in her file until 2020 referencing that she'd gone through a screening, even though a screening that's supposed to identify if she was at risk or had actually experienced sex trafficking. And even though Oregon's had a law requiring that those are filled out whenever a kid goes missing or runs away from care for years, and she'd run away and gone missing quite a lot.
So it sounds like this screening or these screenings are one of the key tools that the foster system has to keep kids safe, to find out what's going on and maybe, if they uncover something, to offer services. Is that right?
Yeah, it is. It could do a couple things to both identify if individual children or youth need some services, if they've experienced or they're at risk of trafficking. And it could just put the workers who are working with them on more of an alert to keep an eye out for this. It can also, if they identify that this happened, it should be reported to law enforcement, because that's something that it's also unclear that it really happens very often, is getting justice for these kids. The other thing would be getting better data on it, because I've heard that can be kind of a cycle, that if instances of this are not being quantified correctly and they're missing a lot of them, then not as much resources are going to be dedicated to it. There's less of that fire under people to, let's get some evidence-based or the best possible kinds of programs and services available for these youth, who are not also all they're not all female. And people,
thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah, and people at the state would reference that there can be male children or children with different gender identities that are involved in this. But if you go ask them for data quantifying how often this is happening to kids by gender or other demographics, they don't have it. So that's the bottom line, is they just haven't had that good data, and they only in the last couple of years have started getting better data on the numbers of kids that this is happening to, but they still can't tell you how many of them identify as male or female or non-binary or anything.
That's incredible. So it sounds like we need better screening or training also for these caseworkers to do the screenings correctly. We need to gather more data about these children and what's happening to them. What else can the state do to keep children like Grace safe? And then if they find out that trafficking did take place, to help them?
Yeah, that's a good question. We could see with Grace's case that she dealt with at least a couple different systems in the state, because she was also coming in contact with the criminal justice system, both because, and we didn't cover all of this in the story because of limits on length, but she was coming in contact with the criminal justice system because the cops would be talking to her after she had gone missing, and then it was learned that she was exploited. And so there was that. And then at some point, the men who'd exploited her, who were in some cases much older, like one was 30 years old when she was just 14. So then she'd be dealing with prosecutors. So that's another system that she'd be involved with. Oh, and she had also, so what we didn't get into in the story because of limits on space and a really long story was one of her traffickers also connected her with someone who took her out to Eastern Oregon for a couple days to go fill some bogus prescriptions, and then she got caught. So it's another common thing that that kids who are involved in trafficking will also get caught up in the criminal justice system themselves, even if states are not at this point. Like Oregon prosecutors will say that they're generally not prosecuting kids for prostitution at this point. Other systems that often could have some involvement with kids could even be housing, and that's something that there have been some federal recommendations for helping kids get more supportive. If they're older teens, for example, there might be some more supportive housing that could be available.
What about therapy or some kind of specialized therapy for children who are victims?
That's an interesting one. From what I had heard, there's not a specific treatment for kids who are survivors of sex trafficking. There are
trauma.
It would just be different kinds of interventions or treatments that are available for people who've gone through trauma generally. So if they're dealing with substance use, addiction, getting them connected with those services. If it's cognitive behavioral therapy for some trauma, then it would be that as well. But there's not at one go-to, like, okay, this is a research-backed range of, or some kind of combination of services that really helps young people get out of this life.
So it sounds like more research is needed in general in this area.
Yeah.
So, one thing that when I read the story, what came to my mind is all the other stories that I've read about the foster care system and child abuse within the foster care system and neglect. But this story seemed to stand out in a different way because it focused on sex trafficking as well. And so I'm wondering if this is one of the first stories that focuses on this. Like, is this a topic that has not been explored in the media, and is just slowly coming to light as, there's more attention from the federal government and the state government on it?
I did look at that when I was reporting this story, and I saw some about a decade ago. And back then, it still might have been covered in sort of the terminology that might have been used would be child prostitution more often.
Mm-hmm.
So there's been some coverage. I haven't seen so much in the last few years, although there was a report that I think came out of Investigative West that was talking about something that we touched on in this story, which was the lack of federal data. States were supposed to be reporting federal data, reporting data from their foster care systems on the numbers of children who were trafficked while in state care, and that requirement was delayed for years. So there was this requirement, and the feds hadn't been reporting it yet. It had been delayed. So, that fact had been reported by Investigate West. I think that what I hadn't seen was a story that followed someone who is still really dealing with this right now, because as we saw, and I didn't know that this was going to come up or be the case when I started talking with Grace. She has not, she's still involved in sex work now, but as an adult. So it's not something that's just in her past. And a lot of times when this gets covered, there will be a survivor of sex work, if they were doing it as an adult, or a survivor of child prostitution or trafficking, and now they're an adult, they're many years away from it, they're out of it. And that's not the case for Grace. It's it's still not that long ago that these traffickers were exploiting her, and she's still involved in this type of life to some degree. Now, and I think it was also unique, I'll just finish the thought. I think it was also unique that we were able to get her case file and see what her background was, which a lot of times when I've seen other stories, they might connect with someone who was victimized in this way, just talking to some kids who are at some kind of shelter or program. And here we were able to, I feel like we were able to learn more about the background and hear her voice talking about how that played into her exploitation.
Yeah, let's hear her voice one more time.
Didn't feel like I had any choice. Now I'm with a little girl, so I was scared of this big ass guy putting his hands on me.
I'm going to come back to Grace at the end, but I did want to ask you about the data, whether you've been able to ascertain how common child sex trafficking is, both in the US and in Oregon.
I was not. I tried looking for any kind of data that I could find on this, and there were no numbers that I could find for how common it is in Oregon across all populations, because certainly it doesn't just happen to kids who are in foster care. And I want to be clear that most all of the kids who are in foster care in Oregon never experience this. It's a small percentage, but I think it's just worth attention because it's such a violation, and so important to think about that these, we as Oregonians and supporting the state and wanting to know about our government, we'd want to know that this is happening. But no one keeps those statistics. The statistics that are out there are not very great or reliable. There's a national clearinghouse of data for kids who are reported missing, and then they can look at how many of those reports trafficking is suspected, but those aren't verified. And then Oregon does not, there's no law enforcement agency that's keeping track of this right now. And I did speak with some researchers at an organization called RTI, and they had done some modeling on data from the foster system in Florida. And in Florida, they found that conservatively, their model suggested that the actual number of kids who'd experienced trafficking while in foster care, there was 3 times the number that the state had reported, because episodes of trafficking just get missed. And so in Oregon in recent years, I mean, I can say for in the foster system, what the story reported was as many as 27 kids were trafficked while they were in Oregon foster care.
Over what period of time?
I believe that was a 6-month period it was one of their reporting periods in 2022 or 2023, which was right when they started having to report that data to the federal government.
So likely 3 times as many, at least.
Well, the researchers from Florida, they did want to caution that you can't extrapolate that data to other states because every state's different. And it's true, every state has different laws that can impact how things are calculated or how they're capturing the data. But it probably just gives an idea that it's some factor of the actual numbers that they're reporting. That's not the true total.
So Oregon's DHS, Department of Human Services, declined to discuss the details of Grace's case when you asked them. Can you tell us what, if anything, the agency is doing for children like Grace, and what was the response in general to your story?
So they have said that they are going to do an internal review of her case, even though it's been closed for a number of years now. And I should say that the current child welfare director, April Flint Garner, was not the director when all of this was happening. Grace's story obviously goes back to as far back as 2003 when she was born. And so there's been a lot of turnover, change among people, at least at the head of that program. There are certainly employees who've probably been there that long still, but they're doing an internal review. She did say that she felt like this young person was really brave to come forward and share her story, and that this shouldn't happen to kids who are in state foster care.
Yeah, I mean, and I'd like to personally thank Grace and for sharing her story, because I learned a lot, and I think our readers and listeners will too. And it's it is extremely brave to share that, and hopefully it will help other kids as well in the future. One thing I wanted to go back to is this idea of how can trafficking happen to an American girl in Portland, in our city, that everybody thinks is a great little city. Can you explain how a child born and raised in Portland would go down this path, and what sort of the mechanisms are, and including the social media webs that we're all entrailed in now?
Yeah, of course, Gosha, you and I are both parents, and we were talking about this a little bit beforehand, what social media can mean for their vulnerability of kids. So it's certainly good for parents to be aware that a lot of exploitation of kids can start online. And in Grace's case, she was connecting with these older men online. But there are some really specific circumstances in her case, just based on her description of her life. She was missing a lot of things that can be really protective and supportive for kids, like just people that care about them, around them, in the home, and boosting their self-esteem. She talks about this a bit in some of the video that we have of her, how important it is to, she's talking about daughters, but it could be, any kids, just making sure that they feel good about themselves, that when they're sharing something bad that happened to them, that people take them seriously and follow up on that, because she experienced, it's hard to hear how alone she could feel as a kid, or imagine what that must have been like, because these problems were getting brought up, and she was telling some people she trusted, because she had some counselors at some points that she was talking to, or potentially people at school, and then they'd raise these concerns, and then they were listening to her, but then state didn't intervene in a way that protected her from further abuse. So I think it's that level of isolation in this case, the level of trauma that happened to her. And unfortunately, there are people out there that will be able to identify that in some young people, and prey on them. And there's a whole different range of ways that they could do that. But the special agent that I talked to from the FBI, who was here earlier this year, had addressed that some, saying, if kids are with a family, and she's probably thinking of a family that is functional and able to look out for those children, that they would be going after these pimps or these exploiters, and they just wouldn't rest until they're found. But in this case, this child could go missing for weeks at a time, or more than a month, and no one was able to track her down.
That's pretty scary. Yeah, but it definitely made me think of all the stories that you hear, on the internet about people soliciting images and trying to meet with young children, and just how the internet and social media have facilitated that, and the sex trafficking. I'm sure it was happening before the era of social media, but I think now it's just it's this web that they have access to, and so it just seems like it's a lot easier in a way to find these vulnerable young people who have these risk factors that you described, and wheel them in, and convince them to do things that are not good for them and that they regret.
Yeah,
but they're young children, and they're not able to make the right decisions.
Yeah, and I should mention that in Grace's case, she she was exploited online in some ways, in terms of men connecting with her on platforms, including Facebook, where a lot of kids are, for sure. She's a little bit older than some people who'd still be in their teens now, so maybe they're not there as much. But she also ended up being involved in just the traditional kind of selling of sex on 82nd Avenue in Portland that was the prostitution strip when I was growing up in Oregon in the 90s. And so it's happening in both ways, and what hasn't gone away over the years is the demand for that. So that's another thing for people to think about.
Thank you for mentioning that. Can we talk a little bit about what happened to Grace after she left the foster care system and where she is today?
Yeah, so that's a good note to end on, if that's what ends up happening. But so Grace left foster care a little bit after she had her daughter, when she was still 17, and it was rough. It wasn't a situation where things just turned around for her, or the people who had taken advantage of her were convicted and she got justice immediately. She really continued to struggle, and her daughter was living with her mom for a while, but Grace really wanted to come back and be a mother to her daughter. She really cares about not having her daughter have the same kind of childhood that she did. And she talked about in the story how important it is just to love your child, and that's something that she feels like comes easily to her. And I definitely got to see how much she cares about her kid while I was reporting this story as well.
She's 21 now, right?
She's 21, yeah. And she just had a birthday recently, so pretty young. And we talk about in the story that she had another episode where she had been, I think she'd been living with her mom still, and her daughter was with her mom. And she had something traumatic happen in her life that she said triggered her to go back and get involved in sex work. At this point, she was 18. So I'll call it that. But she was working with a pimp, again, briefly. I think it was just a couple weeks. But then she just realized that she needed to go back and be a mom to her daughter. And soon after that, she got approval to get into some publicly supported housing. And then she's been there ever since, where she got her own place with her daughter. And she worked at an assisted living facility for 6 months or so, but then just had childcare challenges. I think she had some challenges with getting her employment-related daycare cut off. So then she did quit that, but she was working on getting her GED, and she got her GED. That was early this year. And then she got into community college classes, and she just started this fall. So she's got...
And a few of her perpetrators were convicted in court, correct?
Yes. Yeah. One, it's already been a few years, and he's out because he had sort of a shorter sentence, and with the time served by the time he was convicted. But then just this last summer, she went to the courthouse downtown and was there to watch the second trafficker who had really done the most extensive exploitation in 2020 that she experienced. He was convicted and sentenced to 15 years.
So some glimmers of hope, but at the same time, she also is still pulled back into her past, into this now sex work. And I mean, this is extremely difficult. These are traumatic experiences. And I feel like for me, one of the most powerful lines in the story was, she was reflecting on her childhood and why, she made the decisions that she did as a, older child. and she basically said that, she felt like she was all about sex. Like that's what she was for. She was for having sex with men. And so this is something that's been imprinted on her since she was a very young child. And how difficult and how brave of her too is to, try to part with this past and find, this new path now with her daughter, her own daughter, trying to go to college, trying to find another way to live, despite all the terrible things that she's been through. Yeah, I mean, it's impressive, and I can imagine how difficult it is.
Yeah, I think it's hard for anyone to understand it unless they've lived through it. And she expressed kind of that feeling to me when she said, if people don't understand it, I can't really explain it to them more. And she talked about how being involved in sex work, there's some aspect of safety, even in that for her at this point. And she understands that most people, that's not going to sound safe to them at all. But if we look at one of the things I think we mentioned in the story was her last full year of school where she was in classes was 7th grade. And so many people, they just went through this whole different experience that she didn't get to have, where they went all the way through high school. They had a graduation, and then they had to think about work or college or something. And
Right.
And it kind of sets you up for what you're going to do next. And she didn't get to do that. And so,
Yeah, she was set up for this.
Yeah. And when she does take steps like enrolling in community college, it's a lot of work, and it's a big change, and it's not necessarily going to feel natural.
Yeah. Well, Hillary, thank you. This has been a really important conversation, and we really appreciate you sharing this story with our readers and listeners. We'll be following this in future stories in the Oregonian, and I'm going to drop a few links to Hillary's stories in the notes. Thank you for listening to Beat Check with the Oregonian. If you like this show, please give us a 5-star rating and review in Apple Podcasts. It helps people find the show. The best way to support our journalism and stories like this one is with a subscription to OregonLive. You can do that at OregonLive.com/podsupport. Until next time, thank you.